Tansei, welcome to Metis Minute, your source for Metis news in Region 7. Because we are nearly halfway through. On today's Metis Minute, we wanted to bring you some stories from the Muskoka region, specifically Gravenhurst. A lot of you may know Muskoka as cottage country and drive up there during the summer to enjoy the beautiful nature that Muskoka has to offer. But we have a lot of Métis citizens who reside there year-round. So today's episode is especially for them, and maybe for some of you cottagers that head up to Muskoka and don't know a lot about what is happening in the municipality. As you may know from the city that you reside in, every municipality is divided into wards. The municipality of Gravenhurst had recently undergone a review of their ward boundaries by Watson and Associates. And at their latest city council meeting, Watson and Associates was able to present Gravenhurst City Council with their review.
Jack Amendola? No, have I got that wrong? You can correct me when you come up, sorry. From Watson and Associates Economics Limited to talk about our ward boundary review. So please come up. Welcome. I got Jack right because my son's name is Jack, so it's pretty hard to miss that.
It's making a big comeback, that name, yeah. Really close on the last name, Amendolia.
Oh, Amendolia,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the mayor, thank you to council for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you today. What we're going to do, as you know, the municipality is going through a ward boundary and council composition review. And what we want to do is just provide council with a brief update today as to where we are, some very preliminary observations that we've made as a consultant team, and letting you know a little bit about what next steps are going to be. Do I have control of the thing? Here. Perfect. So my name, as I was introduced, is Jack Amendolia. I'm a managing partner at Watson and Associates Economists Limited. We're a firm that works primarily for Ontario municipalities and school boards. We do all kinds of work like economic development work, municipal comprehensive plans, sewer, water studies, a lot of different work related to the services that municipalities provide. One of those products that we do are also ward boundary reviews. In addition to the team at Watson, council has also met Dr. Robert Williams. Dr. Robert Williams is a municipal affairs expert. We use him as a sub-consultant on these projects. So a little bit about what we want to do today. Like I said, it's really just about providing a brief update to council, a little bit about where we are, talk a little bit about what we've done in terms of public engagement, how we've reached out to your community so far, a little bit of a focus on your municipality today, so just provide a little bit of background, a little bit of context, like I said, to some of those early observations that we made. We'll talk a little bit about some of the legislative framework, and as I said a minute ago, we'll go into sort of the next steps and some important milestones that we're going to be working towards. So as we've been working through this study, it's kind of sort of one way that I think about it is there's almost two buckets when we think about this ward boundary review. Ultimately, we want to come up with recommendations or at least an observation or analysis about what the current system looks like and whether an alternative system might work better. But really this first phase of this review is, as the consultant team, you getting to know us a little bit, and that was the point of the council interviews that council had with Dr. Williams. But it's us starting to understand the municipality a little bit. We come in with some ideas, with some metrics, with past experiences, but we also want to see whether those are aligned with what council thinks and ultimately with what the community thinks. So that's really this first phase of this ward boundary review and composition process. And ultimately, not just in this first phase, but throughout this review, there's a few questions that we're going to try to answer. And these are some of the things that when Dr. Williams spoke with council, he started to pick your brain a little bit about how some of these things might work in terms of your municipality and your council. And ultimately things that we want to learn from the public as well. Does the present electoral arrangement work for the town right now? And again, we look at certain metrics, and we'll talk about certain guiding principles in a couple of minutes, but sometimes in spite of those metrics and in spite of perhaps not meeting those guiding principles, council system still just works. And that's part of the ground truthing that we do. So that's ultimately what we want to know from you and from the public. Are the wards and is the size of council and the current composition of council ultimately providing fair representation? Is it providing good governance to the residents of Gravenhurst? What's the goal of this ward boundary review? I mean, again, from a consultant perspective, we've come in, made some observations, and we think we know why the municipality is looking at a ward boundary review now. But ultimately, we want to hear from you, we want to hear from the public, and we have so far. And at the end of that, and I think Dr. Williams touched base on you with this, what does council need? Because again, we have certain ideas based on our experiences, but every municipality is different, every council is different. So ultimately, are we giving you as council, because that's ultimately who is going to make this decision or not, are we giving you everything you need? And that can be simple things like, hey, we need better maps, or can you provide this to us? So please reach out to your clerk's department and let us know if there's something that you think is going to be something that we can provide that's going to help you make a more informed decision. So a little bit about why we undertake this review. So we'll talk about guiding principles in a minute, but I think I just touched on sort of that last point. Ultimately, we're doing this review as consultants because we're trying to provide both the municipality and council the information that you need to make a decision. We're trying to prepare you ultimately to decide whether the current system works or perhaps whether one of the alternatives we come up with might work better. Or sometimes it might be a hybrid or some mashup of some of the recommendations that we work on. But ultimately, that's our goal, is to prepare you to make an informed decision about whether the system works or whether you want to look at alternate options. Objectives of the review, I touched on a couple already. Fair representation, I think, is the most obvious one. And when we talk about fair representation, one of the main drivers of that fair representation is to ensure that each ward has a somewhat equitable population, that each councillor has a somewhat equitable workload. And to do that, like I said, you need to consider not only today's population and what it is in 2024, but what is it going to be in the next 4 years or the 4 years after that. Ultimately, we're trying to provide, again, recommendations to this council that should be good for a couple of elections so that you're not doing a ward boundary review every single election. And ultimately, sometimes when we talk to clerks, this can be looked at as an election day exercise. From my perspective, I look at it more like the day after the election exercise, because while we're drawing boundaries that are going to impact the election and that are going to determine, what areas a certain councillor represents, I think it's more about those first two things I spoke about and ensuring that the system works so that the day after election, like I said, councillors have equitable workloads, residents of Gravenhurst have equitable access to their councillor as well. Really quickly on the right-hand side, just a quick sampling of some of the things we've done to engage so far. So the municipality has a webpage that's dedicated to the ward boundary review. On that webpage, you can find everything from surveys to quizzes to topical discussion papers, informational videos. We're trying to make sure that we provide lots of different types of ways for the municipality to engage. People who want to do a deep dive and read a discussion paper on composition, that's there for you. Perhaps if you don't want to go that much into detail, an informational, a whiteboard video might be something more up your alley. So the next couple of minutes, I just want to get into to some of the focus on Gravenhurst that we spoke about in the introduction. A little bit about what your existing system looks like, how you got to this existing system, and then we'll end today with a couple of very preliminary observations. So right now, the different colors on the map on the left of the screen represent each one of the wards, one of the 5 wards. On the right-hand side, you see those 5 wards. You see geographic area of those wards. So you can see that Ward 1, for example, what we sort of refer to as the more Gravenhurst urban ward, about just a little over 7 square kilometers. However, compared to things like Ward 3 and 4, Ward 4 at over 260 square kilometers. It's not just population, it's not just communities of interest that we're going to talk about, but we also, when we talk about councillor workload and access to that councillor, if a councillor has to drive hours to see 2 or 3 people during the day, that has to be taken into consideration, just the same way population or some of these other things are. The other thing there we have are just showing some of the main communities, and I want to be careful to say, no, we haven't captured every single one, and we're open. If there are communities that councillors or anyone, public, thinks, hey, you've missed this one, and this is a pretty historical major community you should be aware of, please let us know. But we're working with your planning department and clerk's department to refine that list as well. But this just gives you a pretty quick snapshot of kind of what Gravenhurst looks like, what the wards look like, and some of the main communities of interest that are contained within those wards. If we switch gears a little bit and just talk about some of the legislation, or I like to joke, sort of lack thereof of legislation, there's not a lot of guidance. When we look at the Municipal Act and the Municipal Elections Act in terms of parameters, criteria, guidelines with regard to ward boundary or composition review, there's not a lot there. Municipalities don't have to do it. There's no time commitment. There's nothing that says, once a ward reaches this population or this variance, you have to do it. It's really something that is driven by your clerk's department, by council itself, and sometimes by the public, because the public does have the power to petition council with regard to ward boundary reviews. But other than that, the legislation is pretty lax in a way in terms of what to do, when to do it. But part of that, I think, is a good thing. I think part of that recognizes that not every municipality is the same. I think part of that recognizes that you can't always just use population and metrics to do these things. So I think there's some good things in terms of that lack of legislation. But let's quickly go through what the Municipal Act does authorize a council or a local municipality to do. So the first one is change the size of council. So if you want to be a council of 100, I'm pretty sure Doug Ford's going to step in, but if you wanted to be a council of 100, you could. You can decide any number that you want. The only stipulation is a couple of things. You have to have a minimum size of 5, and one of those 5 has to be the mayor, head of council, elected at large. So that's the only thing that the legislation says about size of council. The other thing that's important there is that what council determines to be the size is not something that's appealable by the public. So that's something that can be determined by council. Public does not have an appeal right to that. The other thing the Municipal Act says that council can do is how council, other than the mayor that we just said, that has to be elected at large, but council can determine for themselves how they're going to be elected. And what that means is you can determine whether you're elected at large, you can determine whether you're elected by wards, you can determine whether, like this system in a sense, is elected by at large and ward because of the district councillors. So those are all things that, again, council's right to do according to the legislation, and also no appeal rights associated with that authority. So if you, for example, said, we're going to go to 15 members and we're going to do everything by ward, including district councillors, you can't change the number of district councillors. That's determined by District of Muskoka, but all those other things are a right of council and not appealable. The last thing, however, and that's if you have an existing ward system and you want to divide the municipality into additional wards or redivide the existing wards, that's something that you have to adopt a bylaw to pass, and that bylaw can be appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So that's the only part of these components we're talking about in this review that is something that's appealable. Really quickly, the Elections Act, those elements that are standardized by the Elections Act, those are the same for every municipality in Ontario. So when you hold the election, same. The term of office, same. Eligibility criteria for councillors and the mayor, same. How you count the ballots, same. So that is all standardized according to the Municipal Elections Act. The next election, what we're trying to do recommendations for, is the 2026 election, October 26. And anything that if council decides to make a change, those changes have to be made no later than December 31st, 2025, to be eligible for that 2026 election. We are working towards deadlines much earlier than that, and the reason being, well, two reasons. Give your clerk's department plenty of time to deal with any possible changes. The other thing is that last point I mentioned, is that if you do decide to redivide the wards, we try to make sure that it's not appealable, and we haven't had many, but it can be appealable, and we want to ensure that there's enough time from council decision towards the end of the year so that if it is appealed, an appeal can be heard and any decisions can be made, giving you enough time to hit that deadline. So I talked about guiding principles. So I said, there's really a lack of legislation that tells us criteria and guidelines. However, that doesn't mean that it's not the Wild West and we're not just making these things up as we go along. There are a set of criteria that the consultant team uses. There are a set of guiding principles that we use that we've established through doing many reviews over the last 15 years, established through our experiences, through feedback with public and municipalities, and ultimately established through case law as well. Like I said, this is something that can be appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal, Ontario Municipal Board before that. And through those decisions that they make when things are appealed, we take those things and apply them. And a lot of the guiding principles that have been established have come out of that case law. Not only Ontario Land Tribunal case law, but there's quite a popular case, the Carter case, if anyone wants to Google it, that went to the Supreme Court that dealt with a lot of these guiding principles we're speaking about right now. So ultimately, when we talk about guiding principles, I mentioned this at the very beginning, there's a major one. We're trying to ensure that the system has effective representation. But to sort of meet that overarching guiding principle, there's smaller guiding principles that we tend to look at on a more detailed basis, ward by ward. A couple I've already mentioned. Ultimately, we want to ensure that as much as we can, that each ward has a balanced population, not only based on today's numbers, but hopefully over the next decade as well. So that's a pretty main driver of any ward boundary review. And if we think about the provincial and national way that they draw boundaries, it's only population. It's literally census comes out, they look at the new census numbers and redraw the lines based on that population. So again, it's a big part of this review, but important to know that it's not the only one. The second one, I think, can be just as important in certain cases, and that's identifying and recognizing communities of interest. Recognizing that we don't want to draw, if we can help it, lines right through a major community of interest or right through a historical village. If we can account for all of the guiding principles and ensure that boundaries aren't dividing up historical or significant communities, or that wards have similar connections with other communities within that ward, I think that makes for a more cohesive ward, and I think it makes for a better representation in terms of a councillor having to represent, hopefully some like-minded interests and not too many of a variety of interests, again, within balance. And that last one, respecting geographical features and natural and infrastructure boundaries. So when we look at the ward system here, in some wards, major highways or rivers or the lake are used quite well. In some other wards, not so much. What is on us is to find out why, and if there's a reason that some of those boundaries or some of those natural features or man-made features aren't being used as a definitive boundary. Because ultimately, why do we want to do that? So that we can recognize where our ward starts and where another ward begins, even for council themselves. So I think those are really the main guiding principles that we're trying to address through this ward boundary review process. How did we get here? So if we look back, and this is not uncommon, I think, to many municipalities we work at in Ontario, when municipalities were created, whether it was in the 70s, many through amalgamation in the 80s and early 90s, many times it was created. A ward system may or may not have been put in place. Sometimes that ward system was put in place based on former townships. And even if we look at the current ward system, we can look at former townships from the early 1900s and still see some historical significance of those townships. Does it make sense still? That's what we're trying to find out. But ultimately, the current system in the form that exists today was largely created in the early 70s. So 4 wards were established, a mayor, 3 district councillors elected at large. So it's been, I mean, I was born in 73, so I'm 51, so it's been 53 years since that initial system was put in place. Is Gravenhurst the same place? Absolutely not. Recognizing some of that change, the municipality did make a change in 2009. She did go through a ward boundary review with a similar team that you have now, and the changes that were made in 2009 largely reflected the population changes that had happened over sort of those 3 or 4 decades previous. A new ward was created, a 5th ward was created, 1 ward per councillor. Before it was 2 wards in one of the ward, two councillors in one of the wards. So it was a symmetrical design with 1 ward per councillor. And it really reflected some of the urban and growth changes that had occurred. But that was also 2009. Now we're sitting here in 2024, and there's been some pretty significant changes again, especially over the last 5, 6, 7 years with housing affordability changes. The pandemic really changed things in terms of migration and a lot of seasonal homes becoming permanent. So now we're in 2024, and we're trying to say, are the changes that were made in 2009 still reflective of the population today? Maybe. Spoiler alert, I don't think so, but maybe. And I'll talk about why that maybe. But ultimately, that's what we're trying to do, is say, is the system current? Does it reflect what the current population and what the current demographics and communities of interest look like today? Really quickly in the middle, you see 2021, and I alluded to this a couple of minutes ago. So everything that I sort of mentioned earlier, size, composition, boundary reviews, it's all within the scope of this study. Not saying all of those things are going to be changed or recommendations for change. However, the 3 district councillors, and I know everyone in this room is clear about that, but the number of those 3, like I said, that's set by the district. That's not within the scope of our review. So a little bit of what I was just talking about in terms of some of that change. So we look at the 2021 census. Gravenhurst has a total population of about a little over 25,000. One of our first tasks is to bring that 21 population up to 2024. So we look at building permits that have been issued from 2021 census to today to bring that up to a current population. And then we look at population projections by small area as well. But the important parts to note there, between 2011 and 2021, Gravenhurst population grew by about 5%. Might not seem like a lot, but that's pretty much how much the province and the country grow every census period, is about 5%, a little over 1% per year. A lot of that growth occurred in that last 5 years, 16 to 21. So we've had over 1,000 population change. The other important part there, if you look at the 2021 population by ward, you can see Ward 1 highlighted in green, greater than 7,000 in terms of 2021 population. Then you have a couple of wards that are under 4,000. So you have quite a variance, and we'll look at this in a minute, between some of those wards, about 3,000 difference between your smallest ward and your largest ward in terms of population. The other thing that, exacerbates that a little bit is when you look at where the growth in Gravenhurst has occurred, lo and behold, it's in the same ward or in the same couple of wards that are already at that high end of population. So sometimes we look at growth and what we call, you can grow into population parity. Sometimes the wards that are lower or higher end up balancing themselves out because of the way a municipality grows. Here, that's not the case. Here, your largest ward by population is also grown by the most over your last decade and is likely to be one of the significant growth areas going forward. So what we'll look at in a minute, that population variance is likely to just become worse and worse as Gravenhurst continues to grow. So this is what I was talking about. So this is back to the map that I showed earlier, and it has some similarities. It still has the geographic area. But now we've put in the 2021 census population by ward, and you can see what we looked at graphically a second ago, some of that variance. So and maybe I'll preface this by going back to the guiding principle and some of the case law and Ontario Land Tribunal decisions. Again, there's nothing in the legislation that says you have to be within this much population or this much percentage of the average. However, in terms of case law and OLT decisions, they do not really want wards to exceed the average population by greater or less than 25%. So that's kind of recognizing that, sure, in some places you're going to have a more rural place. It's going to have less people. It can't be exactly 100. Everyone can't be exactly even. But 25% is what they consider a reasonable variance. So when we look at wards 1 and wards 2, Ward 1, and again, this is based on 2021 populations, probably worse in 24. 21 population, you're about 46% above that variance, so well over that ideal 25%. Ward 2, on the other side, almost 30% underneath that average. So again, well outside that 25%. Ward 3, right on that 25% line. Ward 4, right on that 25% line. Only Ward 5, within about 18%, is the only one that sort of meets that ideal population criteria. So I was asked at the engagement sessions a couple of weeks ago, it's early days, it's preliminary, I don't want to put you on the spot, some of the public said to me, but do you think as a consultant you're going to come up with some recommendations? And I said, again, preliminarily, it's hard for me to say, but just based on the population variance that we're seeing, I don't think the consultants would be doing their job if we did not give you some recommendations and alternatives to consider that hopefully are going to have some population variance that's going to be better in terms of what that ideal range is. Just quickly, we're getting closer to the end, I promise, just a couple of more minutes. But I mentioned composition at the beginning, and that's something that's in the purview of our scope. So again, just to remind, this council, mayor elected at large, 3 district councillors who are elected also at large, 5 ward councillors, 1 per ward. On the right-hand side, we've just provided a sampling of some places that are similar in population size, some that are similar in geography, like neighboring municipalities in Muskoka and Simcoe, just to give you an idea of what we were talking about earlier, that there is no criteria, there's no guideline, there's no chart that we could really look at and say, oh, you have this much population, this is what your ideal size of council should be, this is how it should work. So just to give you an idea of kind of the differences across some of the municipalities. So again, just to hammer home that there is no right or wrong, right? There's no ideal number. It's really part of talking to you, talking to the public, and understanding whether this number of 9 works correctly, or maybe it should be bigger, or maybe it should be smaller. Those are all the things that we're going to try to understand. So just in terms of some next steps, so today is, we call it an introductory workshop, but in this case, it's a little bit more of an interim update workshop because we've already done a couple of rounds of in-person public engagement. We've done a virtual engagement. Survey's been out there for a while. Like I said at the beginning, we've had the webpage and different ways of interactive engagement there. And hopefully after today, council also is going to be out there, doing their thing and letting residents know how to engage and kind of some of the things that we talked about today. We're going to continue to do research and collect information. Obviously, we're going to continue to hear things, hopefully, from the community over the summer. And then in late summer, early fall is when we're going to come back to Gravenhurst with some options and recommendations for the public to consider. So in this first round of engagement, we had a workshop or a carousel type engagement with poster boards at Terry Fox Auditorium, an opportunity to drop in, talk to the consultant team and staff, look at some of the boards that are lined up in chambers today. In that second round, it's going to be quite similar, but instead of looking at these boards, you're going to have options and maps and different changes and recommendations. And that usually, in terms of engagement, once people see their ward changing or some of the ideas we may have, that usually gets people out in greater numbers. So that's what the plan is in the fall. Then we sort of take that engagement and that feedback that we get, and we're going to try to come back to council after that with probably going to be 2 options. Sometimes it's 3 options for council to consider. It's rarely ever one because there's just too many different aspects that we talked about that usually is not met in just one option. And after that, like I was saying earlier, council may have the option or have the right to choose one of those options. They can ask us to go back and tweak some things. In the past, some councils have done sort of a mashup or a hybrid of a couple of options, but ultimately we're going to come back to you, let you know how the engagement went, what the public thinks, and then get your thoughts on some of those options. So very last slide before I end today, and we like to sort of, and again, clear to council and to the public, this is not something that we're necessarily recommending or an option that we're going to come up with. But we like to show council and the public this slide because it's based entirely on population parity. So I mentioned earlier that the province and the country, that's all they use is they get the census numbers and they go out and say, okay, how do we redraw these wards to make sure that population is equitable? So we did that. We used, our GIS person uses software to come up with, as close as possible. It's never going to be entirely perfect, but as close as possible to a perfect system of population parity. However, there's a couple of things that pop up right away. So Gravenhurst in this example is divided into about 4 different wards. Does that make sense? I don't know. Maybe it does, right? Maybe we're going to hear from public and council that, sure, it makes sense. I know a little bit about Gravenhurst. It does. I don't think it does to me, and it doesn't when I think about the geographic guiding principle that we talked about. It doesn't when we think about the communities of interest guiding principle. It kind of takes those away and says it only looks at population parity. So that's one example. If we look at the south, at the Ward 1 that was created to get population parity, we talked about the existing bottom wards and how large they are compared to some of the other wards. And when we factor in transportation networks and some of the cottage roads, how difficult it might be for a councillor to actually drive around and get to see their constituents. Well, how would it be if we had this existing Ward 1 that's basically, half of Gravenhurst almost? Again, maybe you're going to tell us that that's not a problem and that makes sense. But those are a couple of things that we just wanted to highlight is that with the guiding principles, sometimes they are push-pulls, right? Sometimes you say, I want population parity, and you have that perfectly, and then you say, but I haven't hit any of the other guiding principles. And then you go, okay, let's account for communities of interest. And then you're like, uh-oh, now I have no population. Like we say, it's kind of like whack-a-mole, like you get one and then another one pops up. So ultimately what we're trying to do is give you a system that's gonna balance as many of these as we can. But for some places, you're gonna tell us that what's important to Gravenhurst might be, we want you to prioritize communities of interest. We get that population parity is important, and we don't want to get appealed and lose, so we want it to be within that ideal range, but maybe that's something that's more important to us, or maybe it's the opposite. So I'm going to stop there. I threw a lot of information at you, hopefully not too much, but if there's any comments and questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Okay, well, thank you for that presentation. Very interesting. I'll speak for myself. There's some things that I didn't know, but there was some things, having been the Ward 1 councillor for the first 2 terms, that it was a single person, down from 2 people previous to that in 2009. I know that's a really heavy job load. I'll look over at the Ward 1 councillor. So that wasn't a surprise to me at all. And I think when they did do the redrawing in 2009, I think the growth pockets just didn't fit. That's not where the growth happened. So, but anyway, that's just my 2 cents worth. Council, are there any questions on the information received so far? Councillor Jorgensen?
Yeah, because, thank you for that, by the way. Because population is such a central part of this discussion, how do we know we got the right population? Because I think I read in your, the preliminary stuff that you were allocating 3.7 people per seasonal resident. I'm not sure we even know what a seasonal resident is anymore. How do we know who is living at a house permanently and they have 6 people living there because it's on the waterfront versus what we would call a seasonal resident is with this magic 3.7 people living in each one of them?
I'm going to jump in there. We're not going down what is a seasonal resident.
No,
This is
I'm
not
just
the
curious, though,
exercise for that.
how we're coming up with the numbers that are being used.
Okay.
If we're using numbers to allocate wards, equitable in size, how are we doing that? Because it's not just census
Well,
population, obviously.
no, and yes, but I mean, the only reason I'm jumping in here, Jack, is because this has been an ongoing conversation at the district for a long time, and there's never a right answer. So I don't want to cloud this discussion
Well, I
with
think it's
that.
fundamental to the discussion, frankly, but that's me. I had one other question that probably could get answered at the same time. When we know that, for example, if the most growth is in the current Ward 1, do we make allowance for that as of today so that we don't have to do this exercise again in 5 years because Ward 1 has grown so much?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, and through you, Mayor. I can touch on both really quickly. With regard to the first part, I don't want to get down the whole of the definition, but what needs to be understood is that, so we have a lot of StatsCan information. Our firm has done studies on the seasonal population in District of Muskoka, and we work with your planning department to try to determine sort of what those numbers are. And ultimately, it's based on an average yield that we're going to apply, recognizing, I think, to the point of the councillor's question, that over the last 5 years, it has become more difficult to determine what those populations are and what has become, what I touched on earlier, what seasonal has become permanent, and whether that's permanent and whether that's going to be for another year. Like, all of those things, frankly, are going to be difficult to ultimately determine, but like every population projection and forecast, it's an estimate, and we're going to do our best based on the information and methodologies that we have. To answer your second question, I touched on that. Not only are we looking at what the existing populations are today, but we're going to do growth forecasts. So every ward combination we're going to come up with is going to show you 2024 populations as well as 10 years out. So to your point, we can make that, some places, for example, that are experiencing major growth, perhaps based on the 2024 number, we might not have the parity that we want, but based on the election in 30 or maybe 34, you start to see that parity come online. So ultimately, yes, those are going to be decisions from council to say, do we want it now and we catch up, similar to provincial and national, it's always catch up, or do we want to recognize that maybe we want something that won't be perfect in this election, but will in the next or a couple more? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Johnston?
Go. Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, I take your counsel about definitions. I do agree with my colleague here that it is fundamental. I also agree with you, Your Worship, that it's been an issue that's been addressed at District Council. It was when I was on council 50 years ago. But I made a comment yesterday that you may recall when we were talking about master plans. The world is changing so fast, exponentially. I mean, we've never been in an era where change is happening as fast as it is now. And so my comment, can I call you Jack? Because if I try to use
Absolutely.
your family name,
I prefer
I'll
it.
insult you, and I don't want to do that.
Jack is great.
Good, thank you. So, Jack, in your experience, are there municipalities in Ontario that you're familiar with that have, let's just say, two types of residents? I won't get into definitions, but you know what I'm talking about. Because I'm just curious. And again, going back to the mayor's remarks, it has been an issue in a long time. And one of the studies that was done at district here this year was about how the district is going to change in terms of population, type of population, and migration into the district. I mean, big numbers. So my comment to two of the directors yesterday was that I'm not sure in these days that you can make predictions about, certainly not 20 years out, which is what they were doing. I said, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Unless you have stopping points in the plan, and not just that you review it, but you got to have a plan B, right? It's not just good to say we'll review it, but if it's does change dramatically, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
As I said, it's coming down the pipe. The district study that was done earlier this year, I think, or late last year, said that the mass migration changes coming into the district. So it's a big issue, and as I said, I agree with my colleague that it's a fundamental issue. But to my question, those are my comments. To my question, are you familiar with any municipality that does? I just find it odd, again, not getting into definitions, that you've got two groups of people and one is recognized over the other. I don't understand that.
Yeah, so to answer your question, thank you, Councillor, and through you, Mayor. Yeah, absolutely. We've worked in many places in Simcoe County as well as Muskoka that have very similar attributes and characteristics as your population. That said, I mean, Gravenhurst, like it's basically 50-50, right? I mean, in terms of permanent and seasonal. So it's definitely one of the higher allocations of, again, we don't want to get into definitions, permanent versus non-permanent, I think is maybe a better way to put it. So yeah, there are similarities in other places. And ultimately through this discussion, that's something that we have to start to think about too, right? Is, in terms of how we weight it per ward, in other jurisdictions in Canada, we don't look at total population. In Nova Scotia, you look at just the total electors. So you're excluding everyone under 18. We don't do it that way in Ontario, not Ontario, but the way we do it in Ontario at consultants is we look at total population because we say whether you're 18 and voting, whether you're not, you still should be represented by council. I think it's a similar discussion that we have with permanent versus non-permanent. If you're only here X number of months, do you not have the same rights and access and equity to your council as a permanent resident? I don't want to get into yes or no, but ultimately that's what we're trying to find out. And trying to again, hear from you and the people who live here, right? Ultimately, we don't know the answers to some of those questions. To your point, we can tell you experiences and how we've handled it in some of other places, but we also don't want to assume that how we've handled it there is what's going to fit and work here. You're welcome.
Councillor, are there any other questions? Councillor Robinson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My question is, you had 2 public sessions. How was the engagement there? Did you have lots of people there, or?
So yeah, 2 public sessions were held on a Friday. Just trying to do it on a day where we were hoping, speaking of the permanent and non-permanent, we were trying to hope that we can hit a little bit of both. So we had a Friday afternoon session and a Friday evening session. To be fully transparent, these things are never greatly attended or rarely greatly attended. Maybe like some other municipal engagement that goes on, at least my experience. Even less so in that first phase where it's a little bit more free form. And again, like I said, you don't have maps to sort of elicit some emotions and some opinions. So there weren't huge numbers, but what I can tell you, and your clerk, Jonathan, and I were just speaking about it, is while there weren't big numbers, there were, I'm trying to think of the right word, meaningful numbers. I mean, or meaningful engagement. Best way to put it, not quantity, but quality. The people who did attend, I learned a lot. I mean, and that's ultimately what it's about, right? Is, like I said, as a consultant team, we're doing this to sort of ground truth some of our assumptions. And I know I drove home on Saturday morning going, I learned things that I didn't know before. And some other things where, we have our sort of ideas, some other things were really affirmed for me. So again, not big numbers, but meaningful engagement. And same thing, I think we had, again, not big numbers, but people engaging on the virtual session as well.
Okay, I'm going to go over to Councillor Morphy, and then I do see that you've had an opportunity already. Councillor Morphy?
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. My question is circling around this topic as well. You used the 25,000 number in a lot of places, but the 13,000 in the council composition. Why did you exclude the seasonal in that particular chart? Is that similar to what Bracebridge is doing, et cetera, et cetera?
Only because that chart is based for every single municipality on the 2021 census population. So we didn't want to skew anything one way or another on that chart. So we were clear, if you look at that chart, there's a footnote at the bottom that identifies that. So again, when we get out there, and when we looked at the population by ward, the seasonal population has been included in that, but we wanted this chart to be consistent for every municipality, so that's why we've excluded the seasonal population there.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Councillor Jorgensen. Is there anybody else who'd like an opportunity to ask a question? Okay, Councillor Jorgensen.
Thank you, Your Worship. Always quite happy to wait my turn for my second set of questions. So, population aside, what steps are you taking, or what kind of questions are you asking, perhaps, to figure out is it working or is it not working right now?
In terms of one of the questions, but what we're trying to find out is, from a resident perspective, an important one is access. So when you have access to your counselor, or you're trying to get information or complain about something, or not complain, but whatever, pump something up, whatever it is it easy to get accessibility to your counselor? So that's a big thing that we're talking about, especially in the in-person and virtual engagement. So that's one big thing that we're asking. The other one really focuses on the guiding principles. In terms of your experience, do you think that your ward has too many people, not enough people? It comes back to access again, but we're trying to understand of the guiding principles that we're trying to balance through the study, which ones are important to the residents here. And that could differ depending on what ward you live in as well, and what's important to you. So I think those are a couple of, I don't want to spend the whole time getting into it, but I think those are a couple of major things that we're trying to understand from the population.
Councillor Varney.
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. And I guess my question is sort of what Councillor Jorgensen was asking, is that if the people who came to these meetings, are they suggesting that they're not getting enough representation? I'm Ward 1, so I guess I get a lot of phone calls and emails, but I don't know how it compares to some of the others, but I know I do get a lot. And I always answer them. But I just was interested in, if people are saying, well, I think you should have 2 councillors looking after this ward because we need more help.
Again, thank you for the question, and through you, Madam Mayor. I don't think we heard, and we're going to summarize all of this, like in terms of the survey and what we heard, and all of this will come in a report, so I don't want to be too preemptive on that. But I wouldn't say that from my experience in talking to people the day that I was engaging, it wasn't like I heard major complaints about the system not working. I don't think that's a fair representation. But to your point, we heard some things about some of the wards being large and maybe not having connections within the ward. We heard about definitely the Gravenhurst ward, and we heard about not only the increase in population, but also, the impact that it's not only the population, but for councillors in those wards, you're also dealing with development at the same time. And there's a whole other type of work that goes on with that as well. So I don't think we heard any issues per se, but I think we heard clearly that they recognize the growth in the population imbalance that's happening. And one thing that we always say is, sometimes a system can be out of whack based on the metrics, but it works because of the people around the table. What we're trying to do is take you out of the equation, if that makes sense, because we don't know who's going to be around the table next time, or in 10 years, or in 15 years. So we're trying to provide a system that creates sort of that equity, not in spite of, but because of sort of those factors. So again, to answer your question, summarizing, I don't think we heard outright complaints that the thing isn't working, but recognition that there is an imbalance.
Okay, Councillor Johnston.
Nope, don't touch it. Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, circling back, Jack, to my earlier point about change. One of the things that I stressed with Mr. Williams, was it?
Yep.
Very good interview it was. It covered all the bases, he really did. But one of the things I stressed to him was that one of my big concerns, and I think everyone around the table here, is your point about access. And again, to illustrate change. access at one time was, go way back, how healthy was your horse to carry your buggy to bring you into town? And then later, when we had cars and so on and so forth, it still was determined in large part by geography. Where do you live in the municipality, and where is the municipal office? And councils tried to address that sometimes by having public meetings maybe once or twice a year in some of those areas. Yep. But the point I made to Mr. Williams was and again, about illustrating how things have changed. I gave a lot of shout out to senior staff here and to this council and to the mayor for this. I said the day after the day before my interview, I said we'd had a council meeting where we actually had somebody up there in the ether speak to us, and that was and the mayor was pleased to see that we've been working at this step by step. But so access is not the same as it was before. As long as people have access to not just listen to their government, but what was illustrated by that last council meeting, but can actually speak and make their voice known. You can do that now without the horse and buggy or the car. Yep. So that's a big change, and I'm proud of this administration here, because we're making those. This is groundbreaking. There's no municipality in Muskoka that has this, and so we've been leading the edge. We've been leading the cause on that. I'm very proud of that. But that was all I wanted to mention about the change. That's to me a big change.
Yeah.
It's how you access your council.
Yeah, thank you for those comments.
Okay, council, is there any other questions? Well, there might be some that come up. Sometimes
I
it
hope
takes
so.
a while to digest, so
Yeah.
I would encourage council, if they have any questions, to jot them down and reach out. We thank you for coming today and look forward to seeing what else you have to offer.
Thank you very much. Thanks for
Great.
your attention.
Yes, thanks very much.
Cheers.
Great.
We hope you Machif who live up in Gravenhurst and the Muskoka area were able to learn a bit more about this boundary review and any possible changes to the wards that could be coming in the future. As we always encourage, if you saw something at this city council meeting and this issue affects you directly, we encourage you to reach out to your municipality. In this case, it would be the Gravenhurst City Council, to bring any concerns that you might have about this boundary review. And if you aren't from Muskoka, we hope you were able to learn a little bit more about this municipality while you are also enjoying cottage country. Merci for watching, and we'll see you down the river.